My name's Geoff Thomas from Timebanks, Wales, and I'm going to talk about reintroducing mutuality into public life. And this is the quote from the Welsh Government about austerity cuts, about how we have to think differently about the future. And it's the status quo is no longer an option. There are two basic models of time banking. Most people think of time banking as person-to-person exchange. So when I talk to a lot of people and talk to them about time banking, they say it's about people swapping favours, or it's about neighbours helping neighbours, and that's fine. Nothing wrong with that at all. But it tends to be another piece of furniture in the community landscape. It tends to require a paid coordinator to run that particular program, and of course that incurs expense. So we say we don't want to do that. We want to have a look at person-to-organisation time banking. So the organisation could be a daycare centre, it could be a social landlord, it could be a school, it could be a youth centre, a development trust, social care agency. So what we're saying is, could we embed time banking into an organisation? So it's saying this already exists in the landscape. Could we add value to what is already there? And the questions that person-to-organisation time banking asks are, does the organisation, whether it's the youth centre, social care centre, listen to the voice of the citizen with regard to the design and delivery of the services? And does it then sort of include the citizen in the life of their community? And does it generate active citizenship? So those are three questions that we ask organisations. So when people say, what is the difference that organisations want to make? We sometimes remind them that perhaps this is the difference that they want to make in terms of outcomes. Now, before we go into the future, I think we should go into the past. And if you apply those questions to how organisations functioned in what we term the dark ages, I'll show you what it looks like. It's very much a one-way conversation. And this is where I was born and brought up on this, on one of the great housing estates in Merthyr. And we had this patch of green land, as you can see, outside there, which was good for picnics, for playing cricket, for kicking a ball around, and people quite liked this little bit of green space in the environment. And I came home one day, and trees had been planted in this sort of green space. There was no consultation on the part of the local authority with the tenants. It was, we are the service provider in control, and basically we will do what we want. We won't listen to the voice of the citizen, we do what we want. So they planted this with trees, and if we had been a bit more sort of courageous as tenants there, we would have trashed them. That's what we should have done. But because we were well-behaved citizens, we didn't trash them. And then, many years later, you can see the trees now have really grown, much higher than the houses. And it's locally known as the Getty rainforest. It's good for carbon capture, but that's about all. And people hate it. But that's lack of consultation, not listening to the voice of the citizen. When I worked in Merthyr, again about public service providers being in control and not really working with the community, one of my first jobs was taking work at housing and regeneration. And in those days, there was substandard housing stock in the private sector, which needed to be improved. Nobody would argue that for a moment. But the master planners wanted to knock it all down, and they wanted to decant the people then to the great housing estates of Merthyr. So we spoke to the people. And we said, is this what you want? And the people said, well, actually, you know, if there was option 2 or option B, we would like to stay in our houses. We would like them to be refurbished. And could that be arranged? So we spoke to architects, we spoke to chartered surveyors, we got everything costed a And the cost of refurbishing those properties, not demolishing them, was actually cheaper than the cost of demolishing them and decanting people to the great estates. So we presented the evidence then to the service provider being in control, and we said, this is what the people want. It's a better use of public money, of taxpayers' money. So could you go along and agree with them in terms of the future? And the answer was no. We want to knock the houses down. So they knocked the houses down and they decanted the people to the great estates and moved them. Then 10 years later, this is what it looks like. This is madness. Complete and utter madness. Because people aren't listening to one another. They aren't talking to one another. It's just a one-way conversation of, we know best for you. We are the elected representatives. We know best for you. You take it forward then, another 5 years. And it's all locked down. Demolished. And this hasn't only occurred within South Wales. This has occurred throughout the entire country in one shape, manner or form. And the conclusion of that service provider being in control is that this is not a sustainable model of development. And it takes a special kind of genius to build housing, rent it to the public, and within a few generations end up demolishing it. That is genius. That is real genius. Wow. Unbelievable. So what we are proposing is a new age and a new two-way conversation. It's about changing the status quo. There was a quote by Bevan, and Bevan said, the purpose of achieving power is to be able to give it away. And Larry Bevan was, actually telling us that this is about the sharing and the devolution of power for the public good. And in many ways, he was well ahead of the co-production movement with those types of statements about giving away power and about equalising power. So if we come to enlightenment after we've gone to the Dark Ages, the questions we ask are, how can we reimagine the design and delivery of public services? And what would the devolution of service provision look like if it was driven by active citizenship, mutuality, time banking, and building a constituency for public good? So, in terms of reimagining services, I think it's worth asking the question of what underpins those particular services then. I'll give you two examples of devolution and what it looks like through work that we've done. The first one is with social care. We've done a lot of work with people with learning disabilities. And this is just a sort of little intro into this debate, really. It's anyone who believes that increasing daycare provision is an effective and efficient way of providing services for people with learning disabilities is either a madman or a socialist. That's just a bit. Person to organisation time banking. That's what we're talking about here, centrally. It's always about person to organisation time banking. And the questions that we ask is, does the daycare centre listen to the active voice of the service user, as they euphemistically call people who go there, with regard to the design and delivery of services? And does the centre socially include service users as active citizens in the life of their community? Now, when I worked as a social worker, working with people with learning disabilities, it always amazed me that these people were bussed in each day in Merthyr, from the Gairners, from Merthyr Vale, from Van, from Tenroy, and they were bussed back out at the end of the day, so they weren't being connected to their own community by running a service in that particular fashion, and they weren't even included in the design and delivery of that service. So that was just an example of the Dark Ages again, when the service provider was in control. And this was not only anti-social social services, it was social apartheid, funded by taxpayers. That's what it was. What we're doing now is to talk to people with learning disabilities and say, what would you like to do? How would you like the service to be? And through the conversations we've had, they've said to us, we would like to stay in our communities. We don't want to be bussed back and forth to daycare. We would like to use the skills and talents and abilities that we've acquired, whether it's in horticulture or in other areas, and apply them locally. So we say, okay, could you become community builders and lead community projects? And the answer is, that's what we'd like to do, listening to the voice of the citizen. If you were then going to say, how do we construct services, or how do we redesign services, you redesign it with the people who receive services. So you don't just say, we know what's best for you. Now it becomes more of an interesting two-way conversation. And we're exploring those conversations in the Rwanda and in places like Swansea as well. I'll just give you one quick quote from a person with mild learning disabilities who was speaking to the European Parliament. And it's, I would like to give back to the society who have supported me, through various ways through my life. And she says then that people should have the opportunity to develop and design services together with their service providers, carers and community. And what she's saying is let's have equal starting point here. And let's invite these people into this new debate about what the future could look like. So that's a very simple example of devolution of social care. Devolution then with youth services. The old conversation of youth services was very much keeping young people off the streets, herding young people into youth sheds, defining them as passive beneficiaries of high quality recreational and informal educational activity. And typically this is what those places look like. You would have a youth centre, this type of activity within the youth centre, other types of activity within the youth centre. Again, you ask the same questions to the organisation. How does this service connect young people with a community, social inclusion? How much social energy, active young citizenship, does this public investment in the youth service generate? Are not taxpayers getting good value for money? These are different questions which lead to different outcomes. And they make a difference. So it's about changing the conversation between youth providers and the service users stroke beneficiary. So on a wet Wednesday night in Rwanda, we said to the 50 young people, use a post-it note each. Just write down one thing that's wrong about the community in which you live. And nobody left that blank. And they stuck it up on the wall. And we put them into the relevant groups then. We think that the environment isn't very good. We are concerned about drugs in this community. We are concerned about bullying in this community. So they went to their relevant groups and we said to them in terms of facilitation, well, you are the future generation of this community. These are problems that you've identified. What are we going to do about it? And from that point forward, the agenda switches from them being passive beneficiaries to being agents of change. Now, if you want young people to be agents of change, you have to have a different conversation with them. And that's one simple way of changing the agenda then. So we're saying that the new agenda should be aspirational, based on young people being members of that youth Timebank, of looking at social inclusion, mutuality and active young citizenship. So we said, okay, let's build now this youth centre into a youth Timebank. So we built membership. Within a year, that membership had risen from 20 up to 140 young people who were now members of a new social network within that community as a force for good. We looked at Timebank and mutuality, scored reciprocity in some instances. And yes, we have to redefine work. How do we thank young people for the work that they do? It's 1 hour of active citizenship equals 1 time credit. And the time in would be the time that young people give to their community, and the time out would be, these are the things that you can do with your time currency. You can access facilities, You can access events, activities, and of course we speak then on a much broader scale to the local authorities, to other venue operators there, and they contribute to making sure that young people can use their time currency for things that are relevant to them. A family bus is always good because we put a family bus on, and the whole idea is that the young people then take their parents out for a day trip. That's really good. But that's number 2, which is mutuality. The hours then raised from nil, which was the starting point in terms of changing the culture. Within a year, those young people were giving almost 5,500 hours to their community. So this is getting them out of a youth centre and connecting them with the community. Social inclusion, active citizenship, building a constituency. The change of culture is quite simple. It's from passive engagement to active citizenship. It's from youth worker-led services, well, you know what's good for those young people, to youth-led services. Well, actually, these are our concerns. Can you help them with them? It moves from people being beneficiaries of services to becoming co-producers of that service. And it leads from that person being a beneficiary or a service user to becoming a bloody member. You know, people think, I am a member of this. I'm not euphemistically called anymore. A customer, a client. Disgusting terms that are being used to describe human beings. Some of the outcomes, talking to the young people, is Timebanks has helped me take an interest in the community before I just used to go to the youth club. I think that's quite interesting. The results arising from the scheme, such as increased community reassurance, lower crime, community empowerment, community trust, improved social networks, and increased community intelligence, are extremely successful. That was one of the community safety officers who was involved in the youth project. And the last quote then is, we are now including Timebanks into our training programme for new police recruits, because obviously we put a group of service providers together to help run this particular programme. So it wasn't a unilateral attempt to look at how do we engage young people in a community. It became a multilateral attempt to do that. And I think that we are potentially good at building those multilateral alliances, because people say, yeah, you know, we have an interest in young people, or we have an interest in health and well-being. And we think, that's great, well, come along, be part of that new alliance. Quick sort of summary, 2 sort of points. That's all. The 2 central pillars of change for person-to organisation time banking. And if you remember, it doesn't matter what the organisation is. You can choose that organisation. If they want to change, this can help them to change. Number 1 is membership. People belong there. And every person has a contribution to make, which is valuable to their community, irrespective of disability, gender, race, or religion. And the focus is asset-based as opposed to deficiencies. And the new message is clear. People are not simply defined by their needs and their problems, but are valued by what they have to offer. And I think that's interesting, because when you say to people, what can you offer? There's a lot that people can offer. But oftentimes we don't ask that question, we just provide a service because they are people in need. And the second one is recognising what people can do. That's the work they can do. And thanking people for being active citizens. And you know, the time currency is usually designed by local people themselves. So the ownership of the currency then is defined by the local people. So it's about membership and mutuality, you know, as 2 strong pillars to build person-to-organisation time banking. And the last point, Daniel, is this model of person-to-organisation engagement is not new. We've just forgotten our history. We've airbrushed it, really, and we need to reintroduce these concepts back into public life. We're simply reinventing the best of our past with a humanitarian currency. And the quote from Bevan, for us, empowerment meant the use of collective action to transform social reality through membership and mutuality. and so lift all of us together. And that can be applied to any organisation that wants to change and wants to make a difference. Thank you.
Examples where it started with ordinary people, or are all the examples where an organisation has decided that they want to change?
It's normally with an organisation that decides they want to change. So if we are working with a tenants and residents group, that tenant and residents group might be a small group of social activists within the community. We talk then, of course, not just to them, but we talk to their social landlord, who are told now by the Welsh Government that they have a duty to involve and to increase tenant engagement. We say to that tenants and residents group, do you want to work in a different way and build a membership? And do you want to introduce time banking into the work that you do? Now, some organisations don't want to change. They want to remain exactly the same they are. But we found that some other groups really do want to break with the status quo. So we've worked with tenants and resident groups who want to break with the status quo, and instead of having 10 or 15 members, which they started off having, they now have over 100 members. And that becomes a real force for social good and for sustainable social good within that community. But the organisation has to want to change.